vamos a ir, yo voy a hacer una presentación ahora en castellano, pero después la presentación de Fraser va a ser en inglés, y cualquier duda o pregunta que quieran realizar, la pueden hacer en castellano, y nosotros después hacemos la traducción para que Fraser pueda contestarla e ir acompañando en esta exposición. Antes de ceder, primero agradecerle, thank you, Fraser, for being here. Thank you very
much.
Sort of.
Okay.
Virtually.
Yes. So,
we were going to have this presentation in person on April. I think it was going to be April last year, and it was impossible, obviously, to travel, and it's still impossible. Let's hope next year we can have him here with us at the University of San Andrés. I'm going to do a short introduction of Norman, of Fraser in Spanish, and then I will give you the word to start your presentation.
Sure.
Bueno, empezamos entonces. Fraser Brown es un historiador escocés que se unió a este regimiento de The Black Watch, sobre el cual va a presentar el libro en la reunión de hoy, a sus 17 años, al cual sirvió durante más de 7 años. En 1975 se graduó de la Stirling University y comenzó su carrera en enseñanza en el sistema educativo escocés. Brown fue director de una escuela para niños con necesidades especiales y ejerció su labor docente capacitando maestros en Escocia, la Rumania postcomunista y Pakistán. Al jubilarse en el 2008 retomó sus estudios en historia escocesa y obtuvo sus títulos de máster y doctor en la Universidad de Dundee en el 2006 con la tesis Falling the Children, a Regional Study of the Mobilization of Children of the 42nd Regimental Area during the Great War. Sus temas de interés hoy están centrados en Escocia durante la Primera Guerra Mundial, y en particular el retorno de migrantes escoceses de distintas partes del mundo para servir en la Primera Guerra. So, we have already introduce you to the audience, Fraser, so whenever you want, you can start your presentation.
It's always lovely to speak to people from my favorite city. I have a very soft spot for UdeSA. I spent some happy time there in the archive. So, the book. This is it, 400 pages long, 8 chapters of 7,000 words, 38 shorter contributions. The co-author, Dr. Derek Patrick, and I began this project a few months before COVID struck seriously. But while I'm retired, he was a senior member of staff at St Andrews University, Scotland, with a special responsibility for the welfare of overseas students. So you can imagine the sort of problems we find. However, we were lucky in 4 ways that are worth talking about. First, there's a large amount of British military and civil material online. It was all digitized in commemoration of the end of the war, and that's been very important to us. One of the main things that we couldn't have done this without is a thing called the Battalion War Diaries. Now, I know you will never have seen one, so I'm going to show you one page just for a sample. This is the War Diary of the 2nd Battalion, the Black Watch. It's in our archives, but it's also available online. And what it does is it tells you in great detail exactly what happened day by day by day throughout the war. It's a very important document. It is written by someone of captain grade. And if he loses it, he will be court-martialed and he will be very, very heavily punished. This particular entry tells all about how they took over a large part of the front line from another Scottish infantry regiment, where all the companies were, who was there, who did what, tells you which maps to use, and it also tells you that 6 men of number 2 company were badly injured by shellfire. And it goes on day by day. So we have this information that we can draw on when we were doing this. Second, the British newspaper archive is also online and has a massive amount of material on local areas. Every little town and almost village in Scotland used to have its own newspaper at that time, because the population at that time was 95% literate. Third, the families still have a lot of material. It's not unusual to find medals, to find letters, newspaper cuttings, and so forth. And fourth, and this may sound a little bit crazy to the younger members here, but everybody that took part in this was willing to use Skype so that we could meet and talk face to face. And for some of these guys that were all deaf, we've heard too many bangs. We're all old soldiers. We've had too many bangs, too much gunfire. And we're all half deaf. So it's quite amusing. But anyway, recruiting these writers, getting people to do it. I've been asked a number of times, how did you do it? How did you get 30 people? And the answer is very simple. They volunteer. They're voluntarios. You see, and they fall into two types. There are those who are actually family historians. There are a group of people with a piece of their own family history that they think is important enough and should be remembered for some reason. But it's not just a family history, it has to say something bigger about the war itself. The second type, and I would be included in that, have a particular view of different aspects of the war, and we want to make sure that is recorded. Let's talk about the family historians. They're very diverse. Some were university graduates, and others had left school at 15. Some were retired officers, and others had been sergeants or private soldiers, but all had something from which a historical biography could be researched, constructed, and finally written up. For example, in this case, this is Sergeant Swan. Okay? There was a set of medals, including this medal at the bottom. It's the second highest decoration you can win in the British Army. There was also a newspaper accounts from 1915 of the war for the medal. There's a very good picture of the soldier, 7 letters written home from the trenches. And the more we researched, the more we found. There was a description of the incident where the sergeant won the decoration in the regimental history, and we had copies of the war diary, so we know what we're talking about. In this case, the descendant, the grandson, completed the research process under supervision, okay, and collaborated with the editor, that's me, to write this up in a vignette, a short piece of 1,250 words, okay. The second case, is Daddy Studley and his sons. Daddy is his nickname. Daddy Studley was a long service captain and quartermaster, and he had 5 sons, and they all fought. In that case, the point that was being made was that 4 of the 5 sons were peacetime, regular soldiers of sergeant grade or below, but they were all promoted to officer grade during the war. So why is this important? Well, it's important to include this piece of family history because one of the important questions that arises about the rapid expansion of the British Army during the war was, where do you get the officers? How can you find so many officers? Well, here is the answer. This piece of research showed beyond any doubt that the amount of officers who had been previously ordinary soldiers who were very good and were promoted during the war to officer grade, this is where they came from. So that was this supports other research in the same field. Beyond that, you have this case. I was contacted by a local man, believe it or not, in a bar. Okay, he said, I've got my grandfather's diary. Would you like to see it? You're writing this, you're doing this stuff. So I said, okay. And when I went to see it, I couldn't get over, I was amazed. There was also this violin, okay? And you see, this man had been given the violin in Iraq so he could play for the soldiers. And he carried it throughout the war. The diary covered his war service on board, from boarding a ship on the 5th of January 1917 to go to Mesopotamia. modern day Iraq, what we call Iraq, to the end of the war when he was in Palestine in 1918, 1919. No one apart from the family had ever seen this diary before. Okay? And its importance was that he described aspects of the war that the regimental archive didn't cover. This was unknown stuff, previously unknown. See, he caught malaria in Iraq and couldn't fight in the front line. But he worked in the rear area, which was very unusual for Black Watch men, and he described a massive supply operation in the port of Basra. Of course, when we began to research this man, other material was found. He'd been a well-known local musician in Persia, so there were newspaper accounts of his performances in Scotland, and again the war diary was consulted, good old war diary, and it was found his name is on the list of men suffering from malaria. So it's true, it's there, it all matches. Now, these are three examples where the three sources of newspapers, Battalion War Diaries, and the soldiers' family papers were the foundation of what was produced. The second group, and I'm part of that, were mostly university graduates, okay? Our amateur historians with regimental connections. And we had, some of them, these people were not, they're not historians, but have a vast knowledge of particular aspects, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Some took topics which had been prominent and controversial during the commemoration and looked at these in the context of Black Watch history. One example was that the problem of what we call underage soldiers, who were fighting in the front line under the age of 19 when it's legal to fight. This group picture was taken from the local newspaper. And if you look at the Lee's faces, these guys are some of the, there's one young man is 15, okay? But these are all experienced trench soldiers. They've been fighting in battles for 6 months. The boy at the bottom is David Lyle Anderson, born in Buenos Aires, a pupil of St. Andrew's School in Buenos Aires, sent home to Brecon in Scotland to go to school. He joined the Black Watch on the first day of the war in 1940, age 17, and was killed 3 years later in 1917. Okay? See, this, the reason why this was important was because when people discovered that this had happened, and people in 2018 discovered this had happened in 1918, people at home people in Scotland were very angry. They thought this is terrible, but here we are, and that was that. On the other hand, members of the regimental family wanted to make sure that the close relationship between the soldiers and people at home was not forgotten. Some who looked through the wartime newspapers and discovered the extent to which children were involved in voluntary work in support of the Black Watch during the war thought that this should be included. Others even found pictures of their relatives amongst the local newspaper pictures of wartime children, which confirmed their own family stories of relatives working for the war effort when they were children. So these stories that were family memories were being proven to be absolutely right. In the long vignette, the 7th Battalion and the school children of Fife, the relationship between the Black Watch and the local children of that county was explored in some detail. But the first thing you have to understand is that Scottish children experienced the war in a different way to those in England and Wales and Ireland. And here is why. In that time, as now, Scotland is in charge of its own education system. And while down south, children were allowed to work for the war effort during school time, in Scotland, you didn't do that. That was forbidden. You could not take children out of school before they were legally meant to leave. So children were not taken out of factories in Scotland. The education was defended. However, what happened was children self-mobilized. But what could a child do is a question. Well, actually, they can do a lot. They're very good at raising money. And that's just one thing. In fact, they were so good at raising money that members of the Boys Brigade in Dundee were so successful that the Russian, in raising money for the Russian Red Cross in 1915, that they received the personal award from the Tsarina of Russia, which was quite something. And a lot of the money they raised was used to buy extra uniforms, buy spare shirts and stuff like that. But they were also buying machine guns. They were raising £80 sums of money in English money or British money at the time was £80 for a machine gun. So the school would save up all the pennies and they would do work and they do this and that, so that £80 and would send it off, buy a machine gun. And other things they did was they made periscopes for looking over the top of the trenches. And these boys have went in Saturday mornings and they made these periscopes and sent them off. But the other thing that they did, boys in particular did, was they had school gardens. And they grew a very interesting plant in the school gardens. It's called a poppy. They were growing opium poppies. And they were harvesting the poppies, sending them to a special distiller in Edinburgh, and they were turning it into morphine. So they were in charge, they were actually producing morphine, which at that time was the only effective painkiller for the army in big numbers. But the other thing that the children were doing was this. There is a plant that grows in Scotland, mainly in Scotland, it's not too much in England. It also grows in Ireland. It's called Sphagnum Moss. And this is very important because this is a natural coagulant. It stops bleeding, helps stop the bleeding. And it was used for wound dressings. But it is also has a natural antiseptic quality, almost an antibiotic quality. And the kids, here they are here, the little girls going up the mountains, pulling this plant and cleaning it up and sending it off to do wound dressing. But there was another chapter too, and this was about, it's called The Survivors of Non-Motion. And non-motion was a very bloody battle fought between the 8th and the 12th of November 1914, so very early. This fight was vital to the survival of the British Army. If it had been lost, the German army used the Channel ports and not Britain out of the war. Many years later, Ludendorff himself identified the German failure in a small but very bloody battle as one of the turning points of the war. And all that stood between Germany and the Channel ports were the Black Watch, the Cameron Highlanders and the Scots Guards. And they fought almost to the last man before they were relieved. So it's a very big thing for us. The Black Watch men wounded in that fight were sent home to Scotland to recover. But when they were there, they were interviewed by the local newspapers, and the local newspapers wrote their stories. Now, later in the war, you couldn't do that because of censorship. But at that time, what these men had to say was being read by everybody. So what this chapter did was to take their testimony and look at the battle point of view. So the generals might write their dispatches home. The politicians could make big speeches, but then suddenly in 1940, the voices of ordinary soldiers are being heard. And in 2018, now the book's published, they're being heard again. And this monument here was erected in 2014, 100 years after the fight, where it all happened by the veterans of the regiment. A more controversial topic of the Indian Corps, which arrived in France in October 1914, and to a lesser extent also controversial was the relationship between the British and the Indian soldiers during the war. There's been a very savage debate amongst military historians, particularly the British, on this topic for quite some time. So there's a big budget Hindi language movie called Sajan Singh Rangoon. Okay, and it was released in 2018, and it was very, very critical of the British-Indian relationship. In this case, the issue of the Indian Corps performance in the British-Indian relations was examined through the Black Watch experience. Because in 1914, home from India, over from India, came the 2nd Battalion of Black Watch, 3 Indian battalions obviously from India, from an area called Bareilly. And when they got back to France, they were joined by another Black Watch battalion called the 4th Battalion. And they worked together in the trenches, side by side. So it was 3 Indian battalions, 2 British, 2 Scottish battalions. And here they are. The Indians and the guy, you can tell the Scotsman, he's the one wearing the kilt. Okay. Now, when I researched this topic, I was very fortunate to have not only access to the Black Watch archives, but also to the war diaries of the Indian battalions, which are written in English. The Indian unit most closely associated with the Black Watch was the 58th Rifles, and they had a very good regimental history written in 1933. So the details of the fighting could be cross-referenced and so forth. But perhaps best of all, the 4th Battalion, the Black Watch, which is a territorial battalion from the city of Dundee, and only recruited in Dundee at that time, contained a group of former journalists known as the Fighter Writers. And here they are. These men were all former journalists. And they wrote home to the old newspapers about the Indian troops and what was happening in the front line and all the rest of it. So when I came to looking at relations between the Indians and the Scots troops, I can read this stuff. I've got this stuff. So, and it's very high quality material. See, censorship in the Scottish and other newspapers was not at its toughest until the end of 1916, early 1917. So the articles they wrote from the front could be read in their old newspapers. Some of their letters home are in the Black Watch archive. The chapter that was produced strongly defended the Indian performance and rejected the idea of bad relations between the fighting soldiers. On one of the former journalists in the last slide who fought in the war was this man here. This is Joseph Lee. He was the author and the illustrator of 2 books of war poetry, as well as a number of other works. He illustrated his own work, and this slide shows 3 quick sketches of men he knew in the front line. These sketches were done on the back of empty cigarette packets, because that's all he had. Okay, there are other sketches he's made on the back of ammunition boxes, and God knows what not. He used them to illustrate, sent them home. They were used to illustrate his book, Workaday Warrior. He was well known during the Great War, but after 1950, he was overlooked a bit, and then he came back, and his work came back into fashion in 1990. Now, for some reason, Black Watch soldiers of the Great War included 2 other poets who were acknowledged as being very seriously good, and one internationally recognized war artist, and so forth. Now, you see, Lee's returning to the idea of the relationship between the Indians and the Scots. One of the things that Lee did was Lee had a particular friend, and here he is. This is a man called Ullad, and Ullad was the 50th man in the 50th Rifles, and he was one of the medics, the medical corps men. And after one particular battle, a terrible battle at Oberfritsch, the Indians cleared the Black Watch wounded from the battlefield, and this is what this poem is. It's in tribute to the Indian Corps. And after the battle, this is a Black Watch piper. You can tell he's Black Watch because of the badge on his hat up there, and he's playing to the Indian and the Black Watch wounded after the battle. Now, the author of this particular vignette, his connection is he's a graduate of St Andrews, Scotland. Okay, and he's also an authority on Joseph Lee. He saw the book as an opportunity to place his private research in print and to help keep alive Lee's work. Of course, there are some contributions that can only appear in a book about the Scottish regiment, and one of these was in the place of the bagpipes and the men who played them during the Great War. It was acknowledged by it was produced by a former pipe major in the Black Watch, who's the internationally acknowledged authority on the pipes. He's an international judge as well. And he's been identifying and researching the pipers and the music of the regiment for quite some time. He's a very good example of one of the authors who's an authority in his own subject, but he's not a trained historian. Okay, so what happened was the chapter was produced in partnership with me. Okay, the image of the piper alone, usually armed only with a pistol, leading men into battle, is associated with Scottish regiments. And in many of these great battles of the Great War, this was a hard, bitter, cold reality. Okay, now this is a slide taken from a picture from the Imperial War Museum, and it also exists in Black Watch Archive, of a guy called Piper Finlayton, VC. VC is the highest award you can win. On the first attack at the Battle of Lewes, he jumps up onto the top of the trench, plays his pipes, and leads them in. And was lucky enough to only get shot a bit. Okay. In the Black Watch, you see that the hard figures are, in the Black Watch, there were 382 pipers who fought in the front line. Of these, 78 were killed and 103 were wounded. So that's 50% were shot down. 6 more were wounded and made prisoner. But what's generally not understood even in Britain is that pipers are not bandsmen. They're fighting soldiers, they always were. And amongst other things, this chapter explores the role of the pipes and the music in creating an esprit de corps amongst the recruits, and how the pipes and the music is a constant reminder to these guys of exactly what is expected of them and who they are. It's about identity in a very big way. Another aspect of the book that was particularly Scottish and has caused some surprise and comment here is a chapter called Combatant Ministers and Sons of the Manse. Now, it deals with ordained ministers of the Church of Scotland and the United Free Church of Scotland who fought during the war. This is the memorial in St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, right? Now, in order that there are no mistakes, I'm going to put some text on the screen. If you just read the Spanish bit, you'll see what I'm talking about. I want to make sure that you take my point. Okay. Right. In 1914, over 85% of the population of Scotland were Presbyterian Protestants. And when conscription was introduced in 1916 in Britain, all ministers of religion of military age had to serve in the armed forces. While some served as military chaplains, the Scots Presbyterians, most served as combatant soldiers, and most of them had joined before conscription. They were volunteers. And most of them, almost all of them, were infantry officers fighting in the front line. Okay, you can imagine how people who don't really know much about this were a bit shocked by that idea, that a man of God would pick up a gun. See, Anglican priests in England and in Scotland were forbidden to fight by the Archbishop of Canterbury. But in Scotland, there's this long tradition of ministers of the Church of Scotland leading soldiers into battle and fighting. This slide, an example, shows one of them. This is the Lieutenant, the Reverend W.N. Moncrief, formerly of Buenos Aires and latterly Ely Parish Church in Fife, killed in action on 25th of September 1915. Okay. He explained why he did it. He based this decision on the Bible. Verse 32.6 from the book of Numbers in the Old Testament. Shall thy brethren go to war, and shall you just sit there? That's the verse. It's clear from his farewell sermon that going off to fight had been no easy decision. But he could not ask men to fight if he was not willing to do it himself. Yeah, this is what this is all about. So he joined the army, joined the Black Watch, trained as an infantry officer, was killed in the Battle of Lewes on the 25th of September 1915. The other thing that the overseas readers found hard to understand in this chapter was that of all the social groups in Scotland during the Great War, more sons of Presbyterian ministers were fought and were killed than the sons of any other group in Scottish society. And nobody knows why. Okay, so in the end, what did we achieve? In a sense, the book was a history of the regiment produced by the regimental family, from generals to drummer boys, and by the descendants of the men of 1914, 1918. It examined the particular aspects of the war from a regimental, not from an army point of view. Yeah, it was a history that reflected the concerns of the regimental family, that although the oral tradition might not be strong enough now to keep the story alive, these have been properly researched and recorded for the future generation. It reflected a particular concern felt by a large number of contributors that the close relationship between the people at home and those who fought would not be forgotten. It also recorded and explained those aspects of regimental history that are particularly Scottish and were not to be found elsewhere in the British Army. And that's basically that. Okay.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Fraser. Y abrimos entonces a preguntas. Yo voy a coordinar la cuestión de las preguntas. Lo que me gustaría es decirles a todos que si prefieren hacer las preguntas directamente en inglés, avisen en el chat y entonces yo les voy dando la palabra a cada uno para que la haga. Pueden escribirlas también. He visto que ya tenemos una pregunta acá en el chat escrita por Robert Fraser. Y la otra opción que tienen también es, por supuesto, hacer las preguntas en castellano, tanto directamente como por escrito, y en ese caso yo se las traduzco a Fraser para que las vaya respondiendo. Así que, bueno, queda abierta la posibilidad de hacer preguntas a partir de ahora. Podemos empezar con la que ya tenemos. Y veo que Alina también tiene una pregunta ahí. Así que empezamos entonces con estas. Fraser, so we have one question already, or yes, we have one question here in the chat from Robert Fraser, who says, who asks, why were there differences between the different confessions, and that why was it that only Presbyterians were actually fighting, Presbyterian ministers, I mean, were only fighting in the war? If you don't mind, we could get a couple more questions before you answer, so that we can give people afterwards time to get their own questions in. Alina, you wanted to ask something?
Yes, yes. I have two questions for Fraser. Yeah. Thank you very much. First, thank you very much for joining us and sharing this wonderful book. We want to read it as soon as we can get to it. We are going to ask the university to buy it. So if there's anyone who would like to read it, it will be available in a few months, I think so, at the university. And well, I have two questions about the book and exposition. The first one, I was surprised to learn of the persistence of Scottish or Highland traditions in the 20th century, especially during the First World War, a war well known for being one between nations, in which the citizens were recruited under the umbrella of national identity. So my question is, how does this local Scottish identity or Highlanders identity fit in with this the British identity during the World War I? And according to your research, especially I was very surprised when I saw the pictures with the quilt and the pipers, all those elements that are typical of the Scottish identity and the Highlanders. Yeah. And the second question I have is about the function of the regimental families that you defined in the paper that we could read in advance. I could not stop thinking about the clan traditions in Scotland and wondering if there is some kind of relationship with this particular organization and the regimental one.
Yeah. Just to start with the clan thing. Okay. The Black Watch began life as a paramilitary organization. They were Protestant. Many of the clans were Catholic. At that point, they were Catholic. So when you had the Jacobite rebellions, the rebellion against George by the House of Stuart, those who supported the House of Stuart tended mostly to be Catholic or Episcopalian, Anglican. Those who were for what they called modern Scotland, for the House of Hanover, they were the Protestants. So you have the whole thing, the rebellion that you see in Outlander, right? That was really a civil war, but it's also a tribal war, a clan war, which makes it very vicious. It's a religious war, which makes it even worse, and it's just a war. The idea of the word clan means it means family. It's about inclusion. So when the Black Watch began its life, there were Frasers, Grants, Monroe, Mackay, and the other Protestant clans, and they were the ones where the first Black Watchman came from. As time progressed, as time passed, most of the people who joined were from the Highlands. They were mostly Gaelic speakers until about 1800. We still have Gaelic speakers, though Gaelic is very much a dying language. There is an element within the regimental family of the clan. There's no doubt about that. These families, we are not the only regiment who has this business of a regimental family. It's a well-known Scottish thing. It's and British as well. But the idea of the kilted soldier, it comes from what we call Balmorality, from Victorian times as well. Right, okay.
I'm sorry.
It is very much part of Scottish identity. It's the idea of the gilded soldier, the bagpipes, and bagpipes. Is that any help?
I'm sorry. So I did that so we can see you. Is that okay?
Yeah, did you hear it? Yeah.
Yes, yes, we did.
Yeah.
Excellent.
We did.
Very interesting.
So there was this other question about the church ministers and why is it different with the kirk from the Church of England?
It's as much so as theological. When we had the Reformations in Scotland was actually quite quiet. The big problems came with came in many ways from London. The Scots had decided were Calvinist and through and through. The idea of the congregation will appoint the minister. The minister is leader. There is this strong thread that you lead by example. You do not, if you can't do it yourself, you don't ask anybody else to do it. These examples go back to the Battle of Dunbar, where the ministers, that's the first one, well, it's not the first one, but it's the one which is most obvious. And Dunbar was in 1650 something. And the ministers led the army, quite literally. At that point, Scotland was a bit like Iran. It was a theocracy. Now that didn't last, but it was it was pretty bad while it was going on. Even during the Jacobite rebellions, there was a regiment called the Cameronians. It was raised by a minister to fight for the Protestant cause against the Highland clans, and he led it into battle, and he was killed leading it at the Battle of Dunkeld, and all the company officers were qualified ministers of the Church of Scotland. This link went on. Even now, it's got nothing to do with religion and where you have this. It's everything to do with the history and so forth. And this idea, you don't sit by idly, right? The Book of Numbers, the verse from the Bible, and you don't ask other men to do what you can't do yourself.
Yes, I was thinking that maybe this congregational type of church tends to mean then ministers have a different kind of implication with their congregations. So
that's true. They are required to be
separated then. They are not a different class of people.
Yeah, they are required to lead. They don't have. There is no artillery standing behind them. They have no. There is no bishop or archbishop or cardinal. It's them. It's them and their people. And so they have. There's no escape. You know. This is my opinion. They also have a very strong lead into scripture. They will go to the Bible for justification. They will not go to some authority like an archbishop, like the Bible or nothing. You know? So they're quite severe and quite strict.
It sounds that way. Let's see. We also have a few more questions here. Maria Godward asks, could you repeat the number you mentioned at the end about the highest number amongst ministers? Something you said at the end of your talk? Maybe Maria.
Yes, my connection wasn't, it sort of failed at that moment, and I didn't hear it.
Try this one. I think this is what you want. In Scotland in 1914, over 85% of the population were Presbyterian Protestant. I think this was the figure.
I think No, it was something. Could it be that the highest, the sons of the ministers or something?
Oh yeah, the sons of the ministry. They of all the social groups in Scotland,
That's
more
it.
of
Yeah.
the sons of the ministry died and were killed than in any other social group, like teachers, doctors, lawyers, this sort of stuff, even amongst working classes and so forth. And the actual, if somebody was interested in looking at that in detail, there is a book called Sons of the Manse, in which every son of a minister is named. And over here we have Memorial Publishing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but
No.
this is worth looking at. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? It's called
Yes.
Muscle of the Manse. Okay.
Yeah.
This is it. And in here, it will tell you, for example, the top one is a son of a minister, Charles Frederick Grant, Captain, 1st 70th Burma Rifles. Okay, he served with the Indian Army. I go down here, daughters of the Manse. Edith H.G. Mackenzie, Sergeant, Women's Army Service Corps. She was a driver, she was driving trucks. Acting forewoman, and her father was the minister of a little place beside Perth called Longforgan, and so forth. It goes on, combatant ministers, John Spence Grant, BD, Bachelor of Divinity, Military Cross, Lieutenant, 6th Gordon Highlanders, Church, Brody Fen. So you can trace these people, and you can do the statistical stuff on it through this.
And you said there's no obvious explanation for that higher ratio of deaths.
No, there are one or two points. If your father was a minister, you would have had a good education. Yeah. If you had a good education, volunteered, and you went off to the army, there's a chance you will become, you probably be made an officer.
Okay.
Yeah. And the officers, the lieutenants and the sub-lieutenants and the captains are the ones who will be killed. They will be killed in large numbers. Okay? There was a piece of a German order that exists in the Scottish National Museum. I've seen it, and it's an order to German snipers. Do you know what a sniper is?
Yes.
A sharpshooter.
The sharpshooter. Yeah.
And it says when you meet Scottish troops, you kill the piper first. If you can, you kill the piper first. Stop the music. Then you kill the officer. Then anybody who looks different. Then you kill the sergeant. And then you kill anybody you can. It is a dirty business. It is a war. It's professional. That's how it's done.
Okay, thank you.
This is one possible reason. But one other thing. The Church of Scotland is very strong on do your duty. We are all the same. If the guy down the road, if the poor man's son will fight, the rich man's son must fight too. So you may be the son of the minister, but you still fight. So this is the duty bit. And Church of Scotland is very strong on duty. Believe me.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so we go to the next question, and that's Florencia. Florencia Rola asks, were there differences in between the accounts presented by different members of the regiment or the and if there were different accounts of the same facts, I suppose that's what you mean, Florencia. If so, how did you deal with the information received by their families? I mean, it's a very interesting question about whether you have, what do you do when you have different versions of the same event? Right. How do you deal with it?
Deal with it? Sympathetically, when we dealt with the family, let's call it the family history stuff, we decided, we said very openly, it's not just enough to do the family history. There has to be a point. There must be something. For example, like there is only this one person with the violin. There's only one account that we have of what was happening in that Iraq, in the base area. And it was the same with Sergeant Swan and some of the others. So it wasn't too bad. We were dealing with one guy. We can look it up, and you have to be honest. You just have to say, look, the such and such guy says this, such and such says that. So you write them both. That was what we did. It only happened, I think, twice in the whole book, and it was how many. This is not nice, but I'll tell you anyway. Sergeant Swan, the man who won the medal, the first slide, he did a very bad thing, very unprofessional thing. You see, it's not unusual for us to have brothers fight together. A German soldier, he saw a German soldier who shot his brother. Okay, he only wounded him. In the middle of the battle, he went after this one German. And he didn't stop until he got him. Now, that's a very bad thing to do. There is no mention, this is in the regimental history, it was seen, people saw it, they witnessed it. But when it came to his medal citation, there is no mention of him being a bad boy and doing that. You see? So what we did was we wrote both versions. We just said, in the regimental history, it did that. And when the book comes, you can read that one. And that was it.
Yeah.
But we have to
must be hard.
Yeah, it only happened. One of the things that's very striking is that the soldiers' letters home that appeared in the newspapers. Yeah, when you read them and you read the Battalion War Diary, they are almost always compatible. All you get from soldiers' letters is very often only a confirmation of what it says in the War Diary, plus some additional details, a few additional details, not many. For example, the other guy, Derek Patrick, the other co-author editor, he particularly concentrated on the fighting part in one particular thing called an attack on a place called High Wood. And High Wood was famous and is well known to us, not only because of the casualties, which were very heavy, but because of the amount of men who were wounded but not killed. And when they got home, they wrote it all in the newspapers. So you can, when you look at the attack on High Wood in particular, it's one company, 200 men, attacked this thing and were very successful and all the rest of it. But you had so many accounts from different parts of Scotland. They were remarkably similar. It wasn't that they didn't contradict each other, of course, some of them did. But not as often as you might think. Not as often as you might think.
That's quite remarkable in and of itself, because eyewitnesses are usually do contradict themselves.
Yeah. here's one reason why they tended not to, or two reasons. The first one is this: if they were unsure of something, they always said, "I saw," and that was it. And if they were asked something else, the reporter might ask, and ask, "Did you see such and such?" I didn't see it. It's very, they would only tell you limited stuff. The other reason is there are so many of these little newspapers, and everybody knows everybody else, right? So you might recruit from one partido if you like. So if something that is not nice goes in the newspaper, that family will be along to see the newspaper people tomorrow at 8. Okay, and this did happen. They would go and visit. If you wrote something bad about my uncle or something, you know, and they will be at your door. So it helps keep things accurate. They could be, sometimes we have a joke, right? You may not, if you don't understand this, it's okay, but the Black Watch, the Cameron Highlanders and the Scots Guards have one thing in common. Oh yes, and Sicily have one thing in common. And it is, they are all like the mafia. Yeah? Because they all know each other and they're all related, you know. And my, they're all,
there is a sort of sense of internal policing of these versions too.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Well, this relates with this relates to to another question that we had here, because Chipsali Hernandez was asking whether there were some aspects of the experience of the First World War that the members of the Black Watch did not talk about. Are there things about their daily life that you didn't get any information about that you think are still unexplored?
Yes. One of them, I think it's to do with social background. They will not talk. They never talk. About social class difference. They will not describe someone, or such and such was he was a nice middle class boy. They will never say that. Scotland, like Britain, in 1914-18, like today, is class ridden, and in many cases quite bad. Our only good thing is we're not as bad as some of the others. Okay, we're still bad. You know, you make no mistake with certain things count. One is where you come from, well, you know, what did your family do, and all the rest of it. And it is, in many ways, the smartest guys always left. The smart guys went to Argentina from Scotland or the Canada or America, you know. These are the smart guys. But class, particularly the officer class and the other and non-officer class. See, I'm trying to think on a good way to put this. We would say gentlemen. You understand what I mean when I say that? Los caballeros.
Right.
No los descamisados, no. Los hidalgos.
Claro.
Y los descamisados son muy diferentes. I think that's probably the best way I can explain it. This is not brought up. one of the big things that came out of the Second World War, or the First World War, was society had to come to grips with and understand that quite suddenly they had all these people who had been officers and were therefore gentlemen, right, by Act of Parliament, and who quite suddenly they're not gentlemen anymore. And it was a big problem after the war. And there's a joke about a certain high school in Scotland, well, it's actually in my hometown, where the janitor was a major and the man who was the head teacher was a lieutenant. Right? The janitor had been in the army before the war, and he was very, very good soldier. The head teacher was okay. That's all. And when the war was over, what do you do? Does the head teacher go up and say, Major sir, what do I do?
To the janitor.
This is crazy. And of course, and it gets better. And there is one chapter, one other thing. There was a group of territorials, volunteers, before the war, called the Arbroath High School section. And the school had a section of former people who'd gone to that school, and it was almost like a social club, this company of volunteers. And some of the students joined as well, because you were paid for this. Okay, you got a day's soldier's pay, and they thought this was a good idea. So when the war broke out, the first year of the war, suddenly 8 members of the school pupils were soldiers. And if they don't go, they're going to jail, right? It's a war. And when people started to join the army, the Herms, who was a doctor from a German, who had a degree, who was a doctor of chemistry from a German university, was the private soldier, and the pupil, his worst pupil, was a corporal. You can imagine, it's crazy stuff. It's bloody crazy. It's absolutely crazy. But it's a world war. Stupid, crazy things happen. That's my only excuse.
It's quite interesting to think that this sudden mobilization caused such an upheaval to the class system, and inside of this tiny communities where everyone knows each other, and then suddenly the whole class system is blown apart by the war.
Well, yeah, it gets crazier by the day. There's a saying amongst some of the people I know who were involved in First World War research. You can look at this and you can laugh and say, this is crazy, or you can cry because you see what it is for a tragedy. And believe me, there are plenty of tragedies, lots of tragedies. There's no shortage of tragedies.
Yeah. But I was very interested about this part of your talk when you were talking about the self-mobilization of children, which seems to have been a feature throughout the war, I think. In most countries. I suddenly remembered that, my husband's grandfather, who came here to Argentina, he was German, and he came here to Argentina when he was only 22. But he had fought in the First World War. He had a big scar in his chest where he had been wounded when he was 14. So he had fought as a child, and he said when my husband and his father asked him about him, he said he had presented himself as a volunteer.
Yeah.
There was a shortage of men at the end of the war, and he
Yeah.
just volunteered, and he was immediately sent to the front. So it happened in Scotland too. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. It tended to happen more with us, and the reason for that is because at that time, most people did not have a birth certificate, what we call a birth certificate.
Right.
You have a piece when you're born, your parents go, you register your name, and you get a piece of paper that says, here you are. This is who you are. You were born in this day. At that time, no, we didn't have it. They were registered centrally, but you didn't have an identification paper like that. The other reason is because before the war, Germany, Austria, every other country in Europe had conscription. So they called up the class of 1893 and 1894, 1895, so forth. So everybody, all males had either done military service, or there was some good reason why they didn't. We didn't have that. So it was, while most people would be called out or called on in the other European countries, with us, they had to go along to the office and sign the paper, So you had this. But as a young soldier in Germany, I used to meet people just like your grandfather, who came to Argentina. I speak German, and I would meet them, and it's, oh yeah, you're the guy, you're one of these Scotsmen, they would make jokes about it, because I know it's crazy to civilians, but soldiers can very often. The soldiers are fine; they don't have a problem. It's the politicians and the people at home. There was a terrible, one of the strange incident occurred in 1918, just very close to the end of the war, around about September, October, when I don't know if you know this, what is called mutiny, where the soldiers refused to do what they're told, refused the officer order. The Black Watch had taken part in this attack, and there were a lot of young guys who sounded very like your grandfather, and they had episodes. And some of these were young boys, but some of them spoke English. And what was happening was, our guys all our people carried 2 days' food in the iron ration, and it is bully beef from Argentina, beef from Argentina in tin can, or wherever, Uruguay, and a biscuit, a kind of hard bread. And our guys were giving this to the German soldiers who'd surrendered, and giving them water. And along came a big British officer. I said, "Stop! Don't give these men. They're the enemy. Don't give them food. Don't give them water." And I said, "We're going to do it." And they refused his order. He told them to stop. Refused his order. He came back with a load of other soldiers, and for a moment, it looked like there was going to be real trouble. And this is what I mean about it. The soldiers are usually okay. It's usually the politicians who are the problem. This didn't just happen with us. It happened at other times too. Germans carrying our wounded, or our people carrying German wounded, quite common. For the professional soldier, it's not personal; it's just business. Not good business, but it's business, and it's a different mindset. And that is it's I think it's one of the reasons why people sometimes they don't always understand what it's about. And I think it's the different mindset also explains the difference between the Protestant churches.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Bueno, no sé si hay más preguntas. ¿Alguien tiene alguna otra pregunta que quiera hacer? Porque ya hemos cubierto las del chat.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Hello there.
Hi.
Hello. Last time I saw you, Norman, was when Silvana, who is there as well,
Yes.
presented the wonderful meetings that we had. Remember?
Oh
that
yes, in the new building in San Andrés.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Well, it was lovely. Well, my question here is, of course, maybe a bit touchy, because I'd like to know if there were any Scottish-Irish battalions, which I presume there were, but maybe you didn't know that they were Irish and they were part of the battalion or part of, I don't know, but I'm almost sure that there were a few or a lot. I really can't say for sure.
One of the things is very interesting in a way is that in Scotland in 1940, immigrants came from went to was Scotland. It was one of the first places they would arrive in, either Scotland or Liverpool. All right. When they arrived in Scotland, they were either they did one of two things. They either moved quickly to the United States or somewhere else outside the British Isles, or they stayed in Scotland. If they stayed in Scotland, they stayed on the west coast, mainly in the west coast, where they worked in industry, building trade. Only a few did agricultural work in the north, only a few. When the war came along, many of these families had already been settled in Scotland for 2 generations, sometimes 3 generations, or some were relatively new entrants. The ones who had been settled and who'd been born in they were of Irish origin but born in Scotland, they tended to join the Scottish regiments where they were. So if you lived in Glasgow, you joined Highland Light Infantry. If you lived in Aberdeen, you joined the Gordon Highlanders. And if you lived in our area, you joined the Black Watch. You could pretty much say that you would have in the Black Watch possibly 5% of men of Irish extraction. Okay, quite a few of them first generation, but mostly second or third generation. It is said, and you can argue about this, it is said that the relationship between the Scots at home and the Irish at home, here in Scotland, changed for the better immediately after the first day of war. And the reason for that was because they were seen to be going to fight. And when the war continued, they were seen, everybody knew they were going to die, and they did die in large numbers. Some of them joined Irish battalions, and they'd been born in Scotland, but they would deliberately go to join somebody like the Munsters or the Leinsters. The Irish battalions tended to be those recruited in Ireland tended to be put in the same brigade as the Scots. Yeah. So you could have a brigade of usually 4 battalions, and 2 Scots, 2 Irish. That was quite common. Or three and one, or 1 and 3. So yes, you did have significant numbers of Irish first generation or second, third in the Scottish battalions. We also had something very unusual happen during the war as well. One of the most, we're talking about now about a Catholic priest called Father Collins. And Father Collins was killed in action with the 9th Black Watch and was mourned by all the Protestants. They were all Protestants. Most of them, or 95%, 90% were Protestants. But he, because one of us, he's one of the boys, captain, and he was a captain, Captain Collins, and because he would come up, no gun, no nothing, and he was sometimes, he would have a pack, and it was always cigarettes, because these men smoked, and they smoked and smoked and smoked, simply because they believed it would keep them awake. If you were caught asleep in the front line, you will be shot. That's the law. If you do that, you will be court-martialed, you'll be sentenced to death. You may be shot, maybe not. Sometimes, a lot of the times they didn't do it, but you're in very big trouble if you're caught asleep. But they believed that if cigarettes kept you awake. I don't know if it's true. They also believed that it cleared your lungs of gas, and they had a few. They also had a few crazy ideas, but. If you're doing that kind of work, believe me, a few crazy ideas is maybe a good thing.
The second part of my question, can you hear me well? Yes, okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. The second part, you mentioned the pipers, of course, the Scottish pipers.
Yeah.
Now, here in Argentina, even today, we have a mix of Scottish and Irish
Pipers. Right.
Yeah.
pipers. It makes me laugh because, I mean, all that question of the division, and no, because the Scottish pipe is this way and the Irish one has a, I don't know what difference. Apparently it's very slight. I mean, it's not a very deep difference. But what about those pipers way back in the war? Yeah, I wonder if there weren't enough Irish pipers too to accompany the Scottish brigades.
Yeah, the Irish regiments a lot of them had pipers, particularly the Irish Guards. They are a very famous pipeline. The Irish Guards, once or twice, I think their pipers led. Most of the time, most of the other ones, they tended not to, because they didn't have very many and they were too valuable to be shot so easily. The Irish, the tunes that are played, the Irish marches tend to be, 6/8 time. With our march 2/4. That's one of the differences. There's the Irish music, Irish pipe music tends to be a more dance music you dance to, whereas the Scots tends to be the marches. But we also have this thing called pibroch, which is sort of classical music for the pipes. And we also have another thing, which is particularly Scottish. The Irish don't seem to do it. Is we have memorial tunes. Yeah, so you have a tune like the famous Battle of the Somme, which would kill so many. Yeah. There's a pipe tune called the Battle of the Somme or the Battle of Waterloo, and so on and so forth. Or for somebody who's famous, they will have a tune named after. When you're famous, in the Scottish regiments is when somebody writes a tune and they call it, Fraser Brown's March or something like that. Nobody's written one for me, sadly.
Well,
you never know.
maybe.
You never know.
Maybe
you're
now.
talk- Maybe now. Yes.
Yeah.
Also, but you're talking about children.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things I came across recently was the mobilization of children in Chile
Uh-huh.
in the British Scottish community. And they did it exactly the same way as we did it at home here in Scotland. I know St Andrews, the kids in St Andrews were also self-mobilized, and they were doing various things. I don't have the details on that, but when I come back to Argentina the next time, I'll be visiting your archive to see what I can find out about that, to add to what I already know. But no, they were involved too.
That's fascinating, isn't it? It's so far away and everything, but to have school children mobilizing.
Yeah. Well,
in a war about a land they've never seen.
Yeah.
It's
there are one or two very bad sides about this that make me some of the stuff I read when I was doing my PhD. One of the things was we had anti-German riots in this town, and nobody was killed, nobody was badly hurt, but there was a lot of damage was done. And the worst of these, the absolute worst of the damage was done by 13 and 14-year-old children. And they went crazy. They could not be controlled. The police were called, the soldiers were called, and they couldn't control them. They were totally out. And the reason, and this thing was, the timing of this was 7 days after that battle I mentioned called Ober's Ridge, where a lot of Blackwash people were killed. And the kids were doing this. They were controlled. The other thing was they went out of control again in 1918. But this time they didn't do any damage. They decided that they were going to run concerts for the soldiers, and the money would go to buy whatever, cigarettes, clothes, stuff. And they would take over the street, and they would start singing down, do all this, and they usually on market day when the farmers had some money, and they would quite simply take over the street and and the next thing, give me the money, and they would raise enormous amounts of money, you know. And they would, you can imagine chaos. And in a place like Scotland, you know, everybody's, you don't do that sort of thing. Yeah, it's very respectable. But there you go, you know.
Well, it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Bueno, ¿hay alguna pregunta más? Any other questions? No? Diana?
No. If I start, we end at midnight.
Oh, yeah.
No, enough. Maybe next
No,
time.
that's great.
We can have
Maybe
a
the
nice,
next time. No, absolutely. We can all go to Cafe Tortoni or Cafe London. And if you're really, really, really good, we can go to Violetta.
okay.
If it exists. But seriously, one other thing, and this is mainly for Alina and for Paula. If you need something looked up over here on the Scottish side, just email me, and I will. And when the lockdown is lifted, I can go and do that. If you need to look up stuff in newspapers or something like that, and just give me a shout, and I'll do it. and that'll be fine. I'll just send it back.
What a generous offer.
Oh, that's okay.
So, and how do we get in touch with you, Dorman?
Right. What I will do is I will send. Alina has my email.
Okay.
And you just give it out, and that's cool. That's,
Excellent.
the other thing I was going to say was, at the moment, from talking about the PECBAL business, one of the things I'm doing at the moment is perceptions of Argentina in Scotland in the public view. Does that make sense? Looking at travel books and some of the newspaper comment on the various aspects in the Scottish press, particularly regarding prospects for migration and stuff like that. I've been looking at the far north and looking at how Argentina is being presented in the popular press. There is also, I have become aware in the last couple of days, I haven't found out who it is, there is someone is doing a PhD on people who went to this, what we call the Southern Cone. Yeah, that's the far south, from the county of Caithness. That's from our far north to your far south, right? And they were the shepherds, the guys who worked for dogs and all this kind of stuff. And they're doing a PhD on Scottish migration. So when I find out who they are, may I tell them? May I?
Yes, please.
Yes,
right.
Please.
Okay.
We would like to get in contact.
I'll do it. That would be great.
But, yes, that would be wonderful. And yeah, when you have something written on this whole thing about how Argentina is presented in the press, etc., get in touch, please. We would love to hear all about it.
Yeah, that would be great. It was great to see it. Great to see everybody.
Thank you.
And always good. So,
well, I think we're all very grateful to you for giving us this introduction to the Black Watch.
Your pleasure.
It's been great.
Yeah,
really great. And it's a fascinating project, really.
Fantastic.
It makes a lot of sense when you see the memorial in the school.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of them on it. And needless to say, there's a chapter on the guys from all of South America, from BVLA, in the book as well. But it's relatively short. So that's it.
Well, we'll make sure to get it and read all about it.
Nice.
So thank you so much for being with us today. And well, we can give Fraser a round of applause, virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Paula. Lovely. Congratulations. You too.
The next time, my Spanish will be better the next time. Honestly.
Don't worry. You're doing well.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Fraser, and all the audience who join us. And it's been a very interesting talk. And let's hope we can receive the book as soon as possible and share it with all those who are interested in here to read it.
So I will go now, and I'll see you in Buenos Aires. Hopefully.
Let's see.
Okay, bye-bye.
Really, we really
I like that. Yes,
we would.
absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.